พ่อแม่ครูบาอาจารย์ which basically translates as mother, father, sage and teacher. And so when we refer to Ajahn Chah, I would call him mother, father, sage and teacher, Ajahn Chah. And every time I would use his name, I would use that whole phrase, mother, father, teacher, sage, Ajahn Chah, because it is reflecting on the teachings of the Buddha that this is a person who gives us, points out the Buddha's teachings, which is the pathway to liberation. And so that is why that we take our gratitude and respect to teachers who teach the Dhamma very seriously and have great appreciation, and so that is why this day has been arranged as a Remembrance Day for Ajahn Chah. And so I want to try and convey this evening something to all of you who are not familiar, say, with the tradition of the forest meditation tradition in Thailand, and also not familiar with the person of Ajahn Chah. I was very fortunate to go to Wat Nong Papong at a time when Ajahn Chah was still healthy and well and still teaching. And so I want to describe how it would be if you were to go to Ajahn Chah's monastery and seek training as a Buddhist, as someone who wants to train in Sila, Samadhi and Panya, virtue, peace and wisdom. And one of the things that was unique in terms of the way Ajahn Chah taught was that he not just taught basic Buddhism or meditation or a meditation technique, but he taught patterns of life training, strategies for dealing with suffering, and skillful means to enable us to end our own suffering ourselves. One of the qualities I think that made Ajahn Chah a particularly skillful teacher was he trained his disciples to grow up and become independent of him by giving them the skills, the strategies, the means and the techniques of training body, speech and mind that the Buddha taught. And one of the qualities that was attractive to all his monks and lay people that were drawn to him, but also of that forest tradition of Ajahn Mun, his prior teacher, was that when you were living and training with him, the thing that stood out was the way of lifestyle, the teachings and the training was very similar, almost identical to how you read about the ways of life, the ways of training, and the techniques of developing Dhamma Vinaya, the teachings and the discipline at the time of the Buddha. When you would read the discourses of the Buddha and then hear discourses from the teacher in the forest tradition in this day and age, you didn't find a conflict. When you'd see the practice of the monastic training of living in a forest, living simply, living on alms round, living with basic necessities, being wandering homeless monks, that was being lived in this day and age. And so you got great confidence because you could relate to the Buddha's teachings in the style and training at the monastery of Ajahn Chah's Wat Nong Papong. And one of the qualities that was very strong within him was his loving kindness. And I remember the first time I met Ajahn Chah, I hadn't intended to go and live with him. I actually had an ulterior motive to go and stay with Ajahn Chah. It's because I'd already ordained as a novice and I had malaria and I couldn't speak the language very well, and it was very difficult to get treatment, go to the hospital when you don't speak the language. And so I thought, I'd heard of Ajahn Chah and read some of his teachings. I knew he was a great teacher, but I thought I'll go and spend 3 months with him and live with the other Western monks because it'll be easier for me to get better. And then I will go and stay with another teacher after the rains retreat. I met Ajahn Chah in Bangkok. He was just returning from England. He had visited Ajahn Sumedho, who had already gone to England at that time, and he was on his way back to the monastery. And a monk took me out to the place where he was staying. It was at a layperson's property, and she had built a kuti in the garden. And he was staying in that hut. And as I arrived, the car pulled up, we got out, and Ajahn Chah walked across the lawn. And so I knelt down and put my hands in Anjali. And he didn't say anything, but he just walked up and took hold of my hands in his. And it was like electric shock went through my body. Suddenly I felt as if someone had lifted a burden off of my shoulders that I'd been carrying around, the burden of the culture shock of coming to Thailand, the change of language, the change of food, the change of culture, the new lifestyle as being a samana, and also the suffering of having malaria. And I was very moved, and my mind immediately said, I have found my teacher. Even though my other mind was saying, no, I just want to spend 3 months of the rains until I get better. I knew intuitively that this monk was my teacher. And the thing that struck me was just his warmth and kindness, his complete acceptance of you. But I didn't know at that time that that was his best trick. Ajahn Chah was very skilled. He used to say that the things that people remember is when they first meet you and then when they leave. So be very careful about how you greet people and then when they leave, because that's what they tend to remember. And so he got me on saying hello. It was his kindness, his warmth, and his care. And I saw that on many occasions, that Ajahn Chah would be very hospitable, incredibly charming, very kind, but it was always very sincere. You never got the feeling that it was artificial. It was just to please you. You really felt like you could trust this person. And that was very unique, because there are many teachers in the Buddhist world, and what I've found having met many of those is that some teachers are disciplinarians and so are very strict. Some teachers you find you can love very easily and are very hospitable and welcoming. Other teachers can be very wise and very skilled speakers, but it's very rare to get a combination of all those qualities, where you meet a teacher that you both respect, love, trust, and also feel a sense of you can accept his teachings, and they're intended for your own well-being. So that is one of the things that would draw people in. And one of the things that Ajahn Chah seemed very concerned about was about your suffering. Because actually we were taking our suffering to him. The monks, the lay people were all going to him and saying, we're suffering, we're not happy, we're not enlightened, please make us happier, please make us more peaceful, please make us more wealthy, please make us more harmonious. And so we were expecting something from him. And he took your suffering and our suffering very seriously. But he had very skillful ways of turning the problem into the solution. In that Ajahn Chah would often not answer your problems or our problems, but he would give you the tools for you to answer the problems, the issues yourself. And that is the skill of a great parent, is that they teach their children the skills of life to deal with problems within life that they're going to face in the present and in the future. But it also is especially the great skill of a great teacher is that they give you and empower you with the techniques to solve your own problems now and into the future. And not only those daily problems to do with money or finance or love or disappointment or work or responsibilities, but those fundamental problems to do with birth, old age, sickness and death. How to resolve those issues. And I will come back to this point further on. So the first way that Ajahn Chah would give instructions was firstly through kindness. But the next way that Ajahn Chah would give instructions, and especially for people who didn't understand the language, was by an example, by being an impeccable example. And his manners, his lifestyle, his demeanour, and his sacrifice for Buddha Dhamma was incredibly impressive. For example, at Wat Nompapong, when I first arrived, the monks told me that every moon day, once a week, we stay up all night. At first I thought they were joking. But no, they said, no, we stay up all night, no one leaves the hall, the meditation hall. We're going to sit and walk meditation. And when I went to Wat Papong the first year I was a monk, Ajahn Chah would lead the monks, even though he was well into his 60s. He would lead the monks sitting meditation all night. And when Ajahn Chah sat meditation, it was very inspiring, because he would sit facing the Buddha image and he would sit like a rock all night, not even moving the slightest. And he set the standard, he set the example. Sometimes you would open your eyes hoping he would move a little to show a sign of weakness, so that then you could move. But no, he would sit all night. And I remember on one occasion, it was a Visakha ceremony. So people had arrived in the morning very early, many thousands of people, because he was a great teacher and people used to come in great numbers to the monastery. And he received guests all day, gave Dhamma talks and teachings in the morning, and then in the evening he went to the hall and led the meditation, led the evening chanting, sat meditation again, and then gave a Dhamma talk till about 1 in the morning. And then he got up to go back to his hut to have a rest, which was quite unusual. And so I rushed to take his bag, because it gave me an excuse to leave the hall. And I carried his bag out, and as we're walking over to his hut, he just nonchalantly mentioned, "I'm not feeling so well tonight, I'm going to have a bit of a rest. I've had malaria for 3 days now." He'd been suffering from malaria for 3 days and no one had noticed, and he'd not shown one slightest sign, and yet he'd been teaching for the last number of days to all of us. And it really struck me then the degree of selflessness, because if any of you have ever had malaria fever, you know that it is a very difficult, painful and debilitating illness. If I had malaria for 3 days, I would probably be in bed. And again, that was just one of those small examples that he led the community, he led the lay people in how to live a Buddhist life. And another thing that inspired me was his example in the way he responded to situations. And I think most of us can hear good teachings and read good Dhamma books, but it's when we see somebody put in a very difficult situation and seeing them respond in terms of Dhamma, then that is very inspiring, especially if we consider how we would respond. And one example I saw with my life with Ajahn Chah was, at one time, it was in the morning, and some buses of people from Bangkok had arrived at the monastery. They'd been travelling all night. And this group of people were being received by Ajahn Chah, and I was sitting right next to him, right close. And the group of people had brought a man who suffered from mental illness with them, and they were going to go and visit many monasteries, and they thought that if this man with mental illness went and made offerings to great monks, then he would create good karma, and that would help maybe in his difficult situation and create good karma for the future as well. But unfortunately this man, maybe it's because he'd been up all night, he'd become very aggressive. And as Ajahn Chah was receiving this group of people, this man suddenly jumped up and ran at Ajahn Chah and punched him in the chest. Full punch, very loud. So much so that when I looked over, and then everyone jumped up and grabbed this man down and pulled him down and calmed him down. And all Ajahn Chah said was, "He has no mindfulness." And then turned to the people in the audience and said, "Are you tired? You must be very exhausted on all your travels." He didn't blink an eyelid, and he never mentioned it again. And to me, that was a reflection. How would I respond if someone came and physically attacked me at this point in time, unexpectedly? Would I just be able to say, they have no mindfulness? And so it was an example like that of someone's ability and skill to to respond in a way which was out of the ordinary. And another example of Ajahn Chah's sort of response to difficult circumstances was one time there was a monk, a very senior monk in the town, who was a study monk and a scholar, and he was very interested in study and scholarship. Ajahn Chah had studied Buddhist scriptures for 7 years when he was a city monk, but he realized didn't lead, just study of scripture didn't lead to the cutting off of defilements. As he said, everyone can spell hatred, everyone can spell greed, everyone can spell delusion, but can we cut it off in our own minds? And so he decided to go off and practice meditation, just as he'd read that the Buddha had practiced and lived the spiritual life, and he sought out Ajahn Mun as his first teacher. Then when he came back and set up his monastery, there wasn't many forest monasteries, meditation monasteries in that area. And this particular monk, he was a scholar, and he was the senior monk of the district. And Ajahn Chah, at the beginning of the rains retreat, he would go and pay respects to all the senior monks in the area. And this particular monk, every time we would go and see him, he'd always criticize Ajahn Chah. We would take the whole monastery, 70 monks, and go and pay respects. And of course his interest was in scholarship, and so he used to tell off Ajahn Chah all the time. He would say, and I remember going with him one time, and this monk said, "What are you teaching these people? You're teaching these monks just to sit with their eyes shut. They can't see anything, they can't read anything. How are they going to know truth with their eyes shut? How are you going to know truth if you just shut your eyes and meditate? No one can see anything, it's just dark." And then he told Ajahn Chah he was teaching everybody to be ignorant and foolish. And he criticized him for an hour. And as we sat there, Ajahn Chah listened to the criticism, and then right at the end, his only comment was, "We will all know on the day we die who was true, who was right." And then he led everybody in asking for forgiveness. Now I found that as a monk a good example, because firstly he was showing the monks that the Buddha's discipline and vinaya is not dependent on paying respects to only those people you like or agree with you or don't criticize you, but it's a way of training to everybody. And secondly, that he showed actually that the important thing is not what other people say about you, but actually what you do yourself, because we'll all measure ourselves, know what we've known and understand and realized in this lifetime at the moment we pass away. We can know before that, but we certainly will be able to measure ourselves at that time. And that is the most important thing. It is not what other people say or do to us, it's what we say and do ourselves. And the other way of training of Ajahn Chah's was through instructions and teaching. So he would be a person who would teach on all levels, teach the most basic things. One of the things that does stand out was his ability to teach lay people and monks as well, and nuns. Some great teachers are very skilled at teaching lay people, but do not develop a monastic following. Some teachers are very skilled at teaching monastics, but not so skilled at teaching lay people. Ajahn Chah had the great skill of teaching all communities, not only Buddhists as well, but even non-Buddhist communities. We used to have a Catholic priest come and stay in our monastery to practice meditation with Ajahn Chah, because he found him one of the most spiritual persons, he said, that he'd met in this lifetime, both from the Catholic tradition as well as even from the Buddhist tradition. And his example was always to come back to the Buddha's teachings, and that's why he always gave emphasis and focus on the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha. And actually, to be quite honest, I think, this is my interpretation, Ajahn Chah would not be so happy with having an Ajahn Chah Remembrance Day. My feeling would be it should be a Buddha Dhamma Sangha Remembrance Day. That would be his focus. That was definitely always his focus. And it's very interesting that actually there's very little about his own private life that we know from his biography, because he didn't talk about himself very much. He never described his practice very much. And if he did talk about his practice, he always told you about his difficulties, how hard it was for him to practice, how difficult, the struggles he had to go through on his path to realize the Buddha's teachings. And in that way, it would be very inspiring for people. But also, he would always point you back to the fundamental teachings of the Buddha. And there are two very distinct fundamental teachings which I think stand out and almost are themes in his Dhamma talks. And the first one is to not look at suffering in the world, but look at the cause of suffering in your own heart. Ajahn Chah used to come over to visit us at the International Forest Monastery, Wat Nana Chad. And he would go down the line of monks and he would ask the senior monk, "How are you today?" And the monk would say, "I'm fine." And he would say, "That's uncertain." And then he would go to the next monk and say, "How are you today?" And he would say, "I'm so-so." And he'd say, "That's uncertain." Then he'd go to the monk down the end of the line and he'd say, "How are you today?" And he'd say, "I'm really suffering, Ajahn Chah. It's too hot, it's unpleasant, the mosquitoes are too many, I can't eat the food." And he'd say, "That too is uncertain." He would go down the line of 20 monks and it was only 2 or 3 words he would say, "That's uncertain, that's uncertain, that's uncertain." This idea of this too will change points to this fundamental realization of the Buddha. The ultimate truth of reality, which doesn't change, is that everything changes. So when you know, not just intellectually, understand completely that everything changes, then you can let go of the world. And then you can see the problems of life as they really are. Don't have to attach to them. When you know that this condition, this experience will change, then you can let go of it, not attaching to it to be the way you want or not be the way that you want. Allow it to be as it is according to reality. And this ability to point out that everything is uncertain is a theme that would go through his teachings. One monk had had a motorbike accident before he became a monk, and then came to the monastery, and there was lots of sitting and walking meditation, and his knees became inflamed again, and it got so bad that he had to sit on a chair, and it was getting very painful and very difficult for him to do the chanting, to sit cross-legged, to have the meal, because most of that was done on the floor and there were very few chairs in the monastery. And he went to Ajahn Chah and said, I'm having all this problem, this suffering because of my knees. And then he said, it's not meant to be this way. And Ajahn Chah said, if it's not meant to be this way, it wouldn't be this way. And he realized actually when he actually said that, oh, that's true. This is how it is, not how I want it to be. So he was able to observe and be aware of actually how things are. Not the way we idolize them and think they should be. And this was an important aspect of his style of teaching, to point you back. He wouldn't answer your problems and difficulties for you, but he'd get you to look at your own mind. For example, if he asked, how are you feeling today? And you said you're not happy, he'd always ask, what are you attached to? Because we know that suffering arises because of attachment. And if there's an attachment there, craving there, tanha there, then suffering will naturally arise. Then he would say, let go of the attachment, because that, as we know in the Buddha's teachings, is the ending of suffering. So that was a very skillful pattern or strategic means that you could take away for dealing with problems and difficulties and suffering within one's life, whether in the present moment or in the future. If there's suffering arising, what am I attached to? When you see the attachment, then that's what you let go of, and the suffering ceases. That is the tool that the Buddha gave us. And Ajahn Chah was just re-emphasizing the truths of the Buddha, making them clearer for us to understand. The Buddha's teachings were already clear and precise and simple, but the thing is, we need to be reminded of them. They're not teachings to be left in books, but they're teachings to be realized here and now. And so another aspect of Ajahn Chah's teachings was that he had an absolute commitment to the ways of the Buddha, the ways of doing things of the Buddha. For example, I remember one time a layperson wanted to offer a Volvo to the monastery, a car. And this was 30 years ago in the northeast of Thailand. At that time, there was very, very few cars on the roads. And a Volvo was considered an incredibly expensive car, even to find in Bangkok, let alone in the northeast of Thailand. And this layman wanted to offer it to the Sangha, and particularly wanted to offer it to Ajahn Chah. So Ajahn Chah said to the layman, "I cannot receive this myself. I have to have a meeting of the Sangha first." And so he called a meeting of the Sangha, and he asked many of the monks their opinions. And some people said, well, it may be very useful if someone gets sick and needs to go to hospital. Someone else said, well, maybe it'd be useful if you receive it and you can go and give more teachings at other places, Ajahn Chah. And so people came up with various reasons to accept this expensive and generous offer. And Ajahn Chah listened to all the opinions and views of the community. Some were for and some against. And then he said, you know, what would the Buddha do? The Buddha spread the teachings for 45 years throughout India. He didn't have a car. I would be embarrassed as a disciple of the Buddha to accept this gift. At that, all the monks went silent and said, "We agree with you." And it was those examples that he would put up to the community as a way of pointing us back to our source, to the Buddha, pointing us back to the source of the teachings of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, the Dhamma Vinaya. The other thing that he'd always point us back was towards respect to the Sangha. Ajahn Chah had immense respect for the Sangha, and that was highlighted many, many times, but one time very clearly when he became sick. Ajahn Chah developed a condition where he had pressure of fluid on the brain, and he had a stroke, and that affected his speech and his mobility. But his mind was absolutely alert, very bright and very clear. I looked after Ajahn Chah when he was in this period of illness, but he was still teaching throughout that time. His body was sick, but his mind wasn't. And the people that would come to him would often see him sick, just in the posters you see outside in the exhibition out the front door, sometimes sitting in a wheelchair. And they would get upset and feel sorry. They'd say, "I feel so sorry that a great teacher like this is sick." And I would tell them that the body you see is sick, but that's not Ajahn Chah. If Ajahn Chah was still attached to the body, then he wouldn't be the person we know as Ajahn Chah. And I saw that so many times when he wasn't concerned for the body. And one time he'd had an operation to remove phlegm from his lungs, and you could see that he realized the body was getting close to passing away. And the doctors they wanted to give him food and medicine through a a nasal drip. And he didn't want that. You could see he realized that he'd had enough. This was enough for this body. There was no further reason to stay alive. It's not that he didn't want to or wish to go. There's no cause. And he refused food and medicine at that time. And so the doctors became very concerned. And so all the monks, the senior monks, came in and asked Ajahn Chah, please, could you take the medicine, could you take food, and could you take liquids further to extend your life? And he remained silent. So then the next day we had a meeting of the Sangha, and then we went to Ajahn Chah and we paid respects to him as a community of monks and bowed down to him and said, Ajahn Chah, please, on behalf of the Sangha and all the laity, we request you as a community to take food and drink and extend your life for the well-being and happiness of us all. And it's only when we asked on behalf of the Sangha